The yellow school bus rumbled down the quiet street in the early morning. The sun had barely risen, and the air still carried a touch of coolness. Inside the bus, rows of seats filled with students chatting, laughing, or scrolling on their phones. It was an ordinary school day, just like hundreds of mornings before. But for Maya, this ride would test her patience in a way she did not expect. Maya was a young black girl in her last year of high school. She was known to be quiet, polite, and hardworking. Her teachers admired her discipline, and her classmates often thought of her as someone who kept to herself. She never caused trouble, never spoke loudly, and always carried her books with care. To most people, she was simply another face in the crowd. Yet there was more to her than anyone realized. At home, after homework and chores, she trained in martial arts. Her father had taught her discipline since she was a child, and she carried those lessons with her every day. But on the bus that morning, no one knew the side of her. She climbed up the steps of the bus with her usual calmness, holding her backpack close. She looked for a seat near the middle, as she liked to sit where the ride felt smoothest. But before she could settle in, a loud voice interrupted her. Derek, one of the boys already sitting near the front, leaned out of his seat with a smirk on his face. "Hey, Maya. The back's waiting for you," he said loudly. Some of the students turned their heads, curious. A few chuckled nervously, but most stayed silent, pretending not to hear. Maya stopped for a moment, looking at Derek. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and known for his cocky behavior. He was the type who liked attention, always making jokes at others' expense. She had ignored his remarks before, but today he seemed determined to embarrass her. Maya didn't respond. She adjusted her bag and tried to sit in the middle row. Derek wasn't satisfied. He stood halfway from his seat, blocking her path with his arm. "Didn't you hear me? The back. Go sit there. That's where you belong." His words hung heavy in the air. A few students shifted uncomfortably, while others lowered their eyes to avoid being caught in the middle. Maya's jaw tightened, but she kept her face calm. She had learned long ago that reacting with anger only gave bullies more power. She stepped back slightly and looked around, searching for another seat, but Derek followed with his mocking laugh. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, pointing toward the very last row. "That's your spot. Way in the back. Go on." Maya's heart pounded, though not with fear. It was a mix of frustration and a deep sense of unfairness. She thought about the books in her bag, the lessons she had worked hard on, and how she had the same right as anyone else to sit where she wanted. But for the moment, she chose silence. Without a word, she walked past Derek, holding her backpack tightly, and sat closer to the back. The bus engine hummed as it continued down the road, but the mood inside was tense. Derek leaned back into his seat, grinning as if he had won. Some students exchanged glances but said nothing. A few shook their heads, but no one was brave enough to speak up. Maya stared out the window, her reflection staring back at her. She told herself to breathe, to remain calm. This wasn't the first time she had been targeted by someone like Derek. She knew that people who sought power through cruelty often didn't understand real strength. As the bus rolled along, Derek continued to throw comments her way. "Enjoying the back seat? Looks good on you," he sneered. His friends laughed quietly, feeding his confidence. Maya didn't answer. She sat still, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag. Inside her, the lessons of her martial arts training echoed. Patience. Control. Balance. These were the values she carried. She remembered her father's words, "Strength is not about showing off. It's about knowing when to stand tall and when to stay calm." Yet each word from Derek was like a small spark against dry wood. Maya could feel the heat rising in her chest. She looked at the other students. Some looked guilty for not stepping in. Others simply avoided her eyes. In that moment, she felt completely alone. But she also felt a quiet determination building inside her. The bus hit a bump, and Derek used the chance to throw another jab. "Careful back there. Don't fall off your throne," he called out. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. This time, Maya turned her head. She didn't speak, but her eyes locked on his. For a brief second, Derek faltered. There was something steady, unshaken, in her gaze. Something he couldn't quite understand. He quickly laughed it off, but the moment left an impression. Maya returned to facing the window, her mind calm again. She thought about her day ahead, the classes, the homework, the people she would meet. She reminded herself that one person's cruelty could not define her worth. She had faced harder challenges before. This was just another test of her patience. Still, she knew that patience had its limits. There would come a time when silence would no longer be enough. And though she didn't want conflict, she was not afraid of it either. Her training had given her more than the ability to defend herself, it had given her the confidence to know her own strength. As the bus neared the school, Maya prepared to step off like she always did. She adjusted her backpack and stood quietly when it was time. Derek smirked as she walked past him, whispering one last remark, but this time Maya didn't even flinch. She walked with steady steps, her head high. The students around her couldn't help but notice the quiet dignity she carried, even in the face of humiliation. The ride had ended, but something had shifted. Maya's silence wasn't weakness. It was control, the kind that comes before a storm. And while Derek believed he had won, he had no idea what he had truly awakened in her that morning. The next morning began like any other. The school bus rumbled through the streets, picking up students one by one. Laughter, yawns, and sleepy chatter filled the air inside. Maya stepped onto the bus quietly as she always did, holding her backpack close to her shoulder. She had decided not to let yesterday's incident disturb her mood. She told herself to stay calm, to focus on her studies, and to keep her patience. But Derek was already waiting. The moment he saw her, his grin spread across his face. Well, look who's back," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Did you enjoy your seat at the back yesterday? Want me to save it for you today too?" His voice carried a mocking tone, the kind that demanded attention. Some students chuckled uncomfortably, while others sank lower in their seats, wishing the drama would pass quickly. Maya ignored him and moved toward the middle of the bus, hoping to sit quietly as she had planned. But Derek leaned forward in his seat, blocking her way again. "Not there," he said, tapping the seat beside him as if he was in charge. "Back you go. Don't you understand simple rules?" Maya paused for a moment. She wanted to argue, but she knew words wouldn't change his attitude. With a calm face, she took a step back and walked toward the rear seats again. Derek smirked, satisfied, and leaned back into his chair as if he had just proven his authority. His friends whispered and snickered, but most of the students avoided looking at Maya. As the bus rolled forward, Derek didn't stop. He turned in his seat, his voice carrying across the rows. "You sit there because you're different. Everyone knows it," he said. His words floated in the air like poison. He nudged the boy sitting next to him and added with a laugh, "It's tradition. Some things never change." Maya sat quietly, her hands gripping her backpack. She stared out the window, but her mind was far from the passing trees and houses. Each word stung, not because she believed him, but because she could feel the silence of those around her. She wondered why no one said anything. There were students who knew it was wrong, she could see it in their faces. But fear kept their lips sealed. Fear of becoming Derek's next target. The bus hit another stretch of road, and Derek found new ways to annoy her. He picked up a piece of paper, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it toward her seat. It landed near her feet. "Oops," he said loudly, pretending it was an accident. He threw another, this time laughing as it bounced off her backpack. "Careful back there, you're becoming a trash can." His friends laughed again, their voices blending into the bus engine's roar. Maya stayed still. She remembered her father's lessons about endurance, about not letting emotions control her actions. Yet inside, her heart beat harder, not with fear but with anger she tried to control. She thought about her training, the hours she had spent learning to focus, to master her strength, to never use it carelessly. Derek had no idea of the discipline she carried within her. He only saw what he wanted to see, a quiet girl who wouldn't fight back. The ride felt longer than usual. Maya's mind drifted to her classroom, to the projects and assignments she wanted to finish. She reminded herself that this bus ride was only a small part of her day. She had bigger dreams, bigger goals. Derek's words couldn't change the fact that she was determined to succeed. Still, the humiliation wasn't easy to bear. She could hear whispers behind her. Some students were quietly talking about Derek's behavior, shaking their heads, but no one dared to confront him. Maya realized that bullies thrived because silence gave them power. She wished for just one voice to speak up, to stand with her. But that voice never came. When the bus slowed at a red light, Derek stood and walked a few steps toward the back. His tall frame towered over the other students as he leaned closer to Maya's seat. "Don't think you're special," he said softly, but loud enough for others nearby to hear. "You stay where I tell you. Got it?" Maya lifted her eyes and looked at him directly. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was steady, strong, and unshaken. For a moment, Derek froze, surprised by the firmness in her eyes. It was not the look of someone scared. It was the look of someone holding back more strength than he could imagine. But Derek quickly covered his hesitation with a laugh, turning back to his seat. The students around had noticed the silent exchange. A few of them exchanged glances. They could sense that Maya was not as powerless as Derek wanted her to appear. Something about her calmness made them curious, almost expectant, as if they were waiting for a day when things would turn around. As the bus continued toward the school, Maya leaned back in her seat. She breathed deeply, reminding herself that control was her greatest strength. She thought of the training sessions where her instructor would say, "The fight begins in your mind before it reaches your hands. If you can control your mind, you've already won half the battle." The bus finally pulled into the school parking lot. Students stood quickly, eager to escape the tension of the ride. Maya stood as well, her movements steady and graceful. Derek watched her as she passed, his smirk still fixed on his face, but inside he felt a flicker of unease. He didn't understand why she didn't react. Most people would have shouted or cried by now. But not Maya. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that unsettled him, even if he wouldn't admit it. Maya stepped off the bus and walked toward the school building. The morning sun lit her face as she moved with purpose, her head held high. She didn't look back, but she knew the day would come when Derek's cruelty would cross a line he couldn't step back from. And when that moment arrived, she was ready not for revenge, but for justice, for showing him and everyone else that true strength doesn't come from mocking others. It comes from discipline, courage, and knowing your worth. For now, she stayed silent. But the fire within her was no longer hidden. The students who had watched from the sidelines had seen it too, even if they couldn't put it into words. Something inside them whispered that Derek's reign over the bus wouldn't last forever. And though Derek laughed and bragged to his friends as if nothing had changed, deep down he had felt something he didn't want to admit. For the first time, he wasn't fully sure he was in control. The third morning came with the same bus ride, the same rumble of the engine, and the same uneasy tension that had been building for days. Students filed onto the bus, chatting about homework, weekend plans, and small bits of gossip. Yet when Maya stepped up the steps, the air seemed to shift. People glanced at her, then at Derek, as if waiting for what would happen next. It had become almost like a show, though most didn't want to admit it. Maya's face was calm, her eyes steady as always. She greeted the driver softly, walked down the aisle, and looked for a seat. Derek was already sitting near the front, leaning against the window with his usual smirk. The moment his eyes caught sight of her, he straightened, almost like a predator spotting its target. "Well, look who's here," he said, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "The queen of the back row." His friends laughed on cue, though not as confidently as before. Some of them were beginning to notice that his jokes were starting to sound desperate. Maya ignored him and moved to sit in the middle again, determined not to let him control her choices. But Derek, never willing to let go, stood up and blocked her path with his arm stretched across the aisle. "Didn't I make myself clear? You don't sit here. Back you go." His words were sharp, echoing louder than the hum of the bus engine. Maya stopped, her eyes fixed on him. This time she didn't step back immediately. She stood there for a few long seconds, meeting his gaze. The bus grew silent. Everyone knew something was different. For the first time, Maya wasn't moving. "Move," Derek said again, but his voice had a small edge to it now, a trace of impatience that hadn't been there before. Maya didn't reply. She simply raised her chin slightly, her calmness almost unsettling. After a moment, she shifted to the side, but instead of going to the back, she slid into a seat just 2 rows behind Derek, still in the middle section. The students' eyes followed her. Some of them admired her quiet defiance, while others held their breath, waiting for Derek's reaction. His jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. He sat down roughly in his seat, trying to cover the sting of being ignored. For the next few minutes, the bus moved in tense silence. Then Derek began again, louder this time, so his voice reached the back. "You don't get it, do you? I'm telling you where to sit. You can't just ignore me." His tone was laced with frustration now, not just arrogance. Maya didn't answer. She pulled a notebook from her bag and began writing, her pen moving smoothly across the page. Her calmness in the face of his shouting made him restless. He slammed his hand against the top of his seat, startling the students around him. "Hey! I'm talking to you." Still, Maya didn't flinch. She wrote as if his words were background noise, like the hum of the bus engine. The students nearby stared at her with wide eyes. They had never seen anyone stand against Derek like this, not with fists or shouting, but with quiet refusal. It was as if her silence was louder than his anger. Finally, Derek could no longer hold back. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the aisle, and marched toward her row. The bus driver glanced in the mirror but said nothing, too focused on the road. Derek stopped beside Maya's seat, his shadow falling over her. "You think you can just sit here? You think ignoring me makes you strong?" he sneered. Maya placed her pen down gently, closed her notebook, and looked up at him. Her eyes were calm, unwavering. She spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm sitting where I choose." The bus went silent. Every student leaned in, waiting for what would happen next. Derek blinked, caught off guard by her steady voice. He had expected fear, maybe tears, but not this calm defiance. His face flushed red, and he stepped closer, trying to regain control. "You don't tell me no," he hissed, shoving her shoulder lightly as if to prove his power. But in that moment, Maya's patience reached its limit. She had endured his mockery, his insults, his attempts to humiliate her. She had chosen silence and calmness for days, believing it was the wiser path. But now, with the shove against her shoulder, Derek had crossed the line. The bus seemed to freeze in time. Maya's body moved before anyone could react. She caught his wrist with one hand, twisting it just enough to make him stumble. In one swift motion, she stood, stepping into the aisle with controlled precision. Her movements were fluid, trained, not wild or reckless. She didn't strike him, but she held his arm firmly, her strength surprising him and everyone else. Gasps filled the bus. Derek's face twisted with shock as he tried to pull back, but her grip was steady. "Let go," he demanded, his voice breaking with sudden panic. But Maya's eyes stayed locked on his, calm and firm. She released him after a moment, not because he forced her to, but because she chose to. She stepped back into her seat, her movements as graceful as when she had stood. The students stared in disbelief. Derek rubbed his wrist, his confidence shaken. For the first time, the power he believed he held had slipped away. The bus continued moving, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Whispers spread from row to row. "Did you see that?" one student murmured. "She didn't even look scared," another added. A few students who had always been silent now glanced at Maya with respect, admiration even. Derek sat back down, his face red, his smirk gone. He tried to laugh it off, muttering to his friends, but his voice lacked its usual arrogance. The students weren't laughing with him anymore. They had seen something they couldn't unsee the moment when his power crumbled in the face of Maya's quiet strength. Maya returned to her notebook, her hands steady, her expression calm. But inside, her heart beat fast, not from fear but from the release of holding herself back for so long. She hadn't wanted to humiliate him. She hadn't wanted to show off. She only wanted peace, but now everyone knew she was not someone who could be pushed endlessly. The bus finally reached the school, and the students filed out slowly, their eyes still on her. Derek stayed seated longer than usual, his pride wounded, his thoughts scattered. He couldn't understand how the girl he thought was weak had turned the entire bus against him without raising her voice, without throwing a single punch. As Maya walked toward the building, the morning sun warmed her face. She walked with the same calm steps, but now the air around her felt different. People noticed her in a new way, not just as the quiet girl with books, but as someone who carried hidden strength. The ride had ended, but the story had shifted. Derek had lost something that day: his control, his image, his power over silence. And Maya had revealed just a glimpse of the strength she carried, the strength he had underestimated from the very beginning. The next day, when the bus rolled up to the curb, the usual chatter of students seemed quieter than before. Everyone remembered what had happened yesterday. They remembered the way Maya had stood her ground, the way she had controlled Derek's arm with calm precision. It had not been a fight filled with anger or noise, it had been something sharper, cleaner, and far more powerful. Students whispered to each other as they climbed on board, but when Maya stepped up the steps, silence rippled through the bus. She moved with the same quiet grace she always carried. She greeted the driver, walked down the aisle, and chose a seat in the middle without hesitation. No one blocked her path this time. No one laughed or pointed. For the first time in many mornings, she sat where she wanted without anyone telling her otherwise. Yet all eyes watched her, waiting to see if Derek would react. Derek was already on the bus, sitting stiffly near the front. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched on his knees. The memory of yesterday burned inside him. He had always been the one in control, the loudest voice, the bully who never faced resistance. But Maya had changed that with one simple act. His pride ached, his confidence cracked. He told himself over and over that he couldn't let it end this way. The bus pulled away from the curb, and Derek finally turned toward her. His voice was loud, forced, like he was trying to remind everyone of who he was. "So, you think you're tough now," he shouted. "One little move and suddenly you think you're stronger than me." His laugh followed, but it didn't carry the same confidence as before. It sounded thin, nervous, as if he was trying to convince himself more than the others. Maya didn't answer. She sat still, her eyes on the notebook in her lap. She knew he was restless, but she had nothing to prove. Her silence unsettled him more than any words could. The students around them stayed quiet too. Some glanced at Derek with frowns, others avoided eye contact. The balance on the bus was shifting, and he could feel it slipping from his hands. Unable to stand the silence, Derek pushed himself up from his seat and strode down the aisle toward her. His footsteps were heavy, his anger written all over his face. He stopped right beside her, towering over her small frame. "Stand up," he demanded. "If you're so strong, show everyone again. Prove it wasn't luck yesterday." The students held their breath. The bus driver glanced in the mirror but kept his focus on the road, hoping it wouldn't turn into chaos. Maya looked up slowly, her expression calm, her eyes steady. She didn't move to stand, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke in a level tone that carried through the bus. "I don't need to prove anything to you." The words cut through Derek's pride sharper than any strike. He blinked, unsure how to respond. The bus grew quieter, the tension thick enough to feel. Some students leaned closer, others gripped their backpacks tightly. Derek's frustration boiled over. He reached out and grabbed the strap of her backpack, pulling it as if to force her up. That was the moment Maya's patience ended. She rose quickly, not with anger but with controlled strength. In a single movement, she freed the strap from his hand and stepped into the aisle. Her posture changed. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her feet firm on the ground. The calm girl who always stayed silent now looked different, like a fighter ready for any challenge. The students gasped softly, recognizing the shift. Derek stepped back without realizing it, his bravado faltering as he faced her. "You don't control me," Maya said, her voice low but powerful. Derek laughed nervously, trying to hide the fear creeping into his chest. "Oh really? Then show me," he snapped, pushing at her arm. But before anyone could blink, Maya moved. She blocked his push with one hand, twisted his arm gently but firmly, and in a blink he was pressed back against the side of the bus. She didn't hurt him, her grip was controlled, precise, just enough to show she had the strength to end it if she wanted. The students gasped, some even whispering in disbelief. Derek struggled, but the harder he tried, the more obvious it became that he was trapped by her skill. Maya's eyes never left his. Calm. Focused. Unshaken. "Enough," she said simply, and then released him. Derek stumbled back, his face red, his pride shattered in front of everyone. He didn't speak, didn't laugh, didn't mock. He rubbed his arm, eyes darting around to see the reactions of his peers. But what he saw wasn't support, it was disappointment, even disgust. Students who once laughed at his jokes were now whispering about how easily he had been handled. Maya sat back down, her movements as calm as ever. She opened her notebook and continued writing, as though nothing had happened. But for everyone else, the bus ride would never be the same. The students began to murmur, their voices filled with excitement. "Did you see that?" one boy whispered. "She didn't even break a sweat," said another. A girl leaned over to her friend, her eyes wide. "She's stronger than him, and she didn't even need to hurt him." Derek sank into a seat at the back, his shoulders slumped, his confidence gone. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. He wasn't the loudest voice. He was just another student, and worse, one who had been defeated by someone he thought he could control. When the bus reached the school, students stepped off buzzing with energy. Whispers about Maya spread quickly, stories retold in the hallways. Some exaggerated the moment, others admired the way she stayed calm. By lunchtime, nearly everyone had heard about what happened on the bus. Maya, however, remained quiet. She went through her classes as usual, focusing on her work, answering questions, and keeping to herself. She didn't brag, didn't tell anyone about what had happened. To her, it wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was simply a moment where she had to protect her dignity. But for the students around her, it was more than that. It was a lesson. They realized that strength didn't always come with shouting or showing off. True strength was quiet, disciplined, and revealed only when necessary. And Maya had shown that better than anyone could explain. As the day ended and the bus ride home began, Derek sat silently at the very back. He didn't speak, didn't laugh, didn't mock. His friends didn't sit close to him. They were still shaken by how quickly things had turned. Maya walked onto the bus, chose her seat, and sat down without anyone stopping her. The bus was peaceful, filled with quiet conversation, but no one dared to disturb her. She looked out the window, the sunlight casting a warm glow on her face. She knew this wasn't the end. People like Derek often found ways to push back when their pride was hurt. But she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. She didn't seek conflict, but she wouldn't allow anyone to take her dignity away again. The students around her sensed it too. They saw her not just as the quiet girl with her books, but as someone who carried a kind of strength they had never seen before. Respect grew in their eyes, even from those who had once laughed along with Derek. Something had changed, not just for Maya, but for everyone who rode that bus. The following morning, the school bus pulled into the neighborhood as usual, its engine humming softly as it stopped at each corner. Students climbed aboard one after another, but the atmosphere felt different from the days before. The usual laughter and chatter were replaced by whispers. Everyone knew the story by now. What had started as Derek's bullying had turned into something much bigger, and Maya was at the center of it. When she stepped onto the bus that day, all eyes turned toward her. Some students smiled quietly, some nodded at her with subtle respect, and others simply looked in silence. Maya, as always, carried herself with calmness. She greeted the driver politely and walked down the aisle. She didn't hesitate. She chose a seat in the middle and sat down comfortably, opening her notebook as if nothing unusual had ever happened. Derek was already on the bus, sitting at the very back. His shoulders were slumped, and his usual smirk was gone. He had spent the previous night thinking about everything that had happened, replaying it again and again in his mind. The humiliation he felt when Maya had controlled him in front of everyone was heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He wanted to reclaim his pride, but each time he thought about facing her again, he remembered the steadiness in her eyes, the calm strength in her hands. For the first time, he felt unsure. The bus moved forward, and students began to whisper. "She's not scared of him," one boy said softly. "She's stronger than he'll ever be," a girl replied. Derek heard the whispers and burned with frustration. He wanted to shout, to remind everyone who he was, but deep down, he knew that words would no longer work. His power had been broken, and everyone could see it. Maya, meanwhile, focused on her notebook. She wasn't writing homework this time, she was writing her thoughts, her reflections on everything that had happened. She knew that standing up to Derek had changed things, not just for her but for everyone who had watched. She hadn't wanted to become a symbol, but in some way, she had. Her silence and her patience had spoken louder than his shouting ever could. At school, the whispers followed. Students who had once avoided looking at her now came to her with kind words. Some thanked her quietly, admitting that they admired her courage. Others told her that her calmness had inspired them, that they wished they could handle situations with the same strength. Maya listened politely, but she didn't boast. She knew that strength wasn't about showing off or seeking attention. It was about knowing when to act and when to stay calm. Even teachers began to notice the shift. In classrooms, Maya seemed more confident, more comfortable speaking up. When she answered questions, her voice was steady, carrying weight that others respected. She had always been intelligent and disciplined, but now her presence carried something more, a quiet authority that people naturally acknowledged. Derek, on the other hand, found himself isolated. His friends, who had always laughed at his jokes and followed his lead, now avoided sitting too close to him. They had seen what happened, and they didn't want to be dragged down with him. He felt the sting of loneliness, a feeling he had never experienced before. He realized that his power had never come from real strength, it had only come from people's fear. And now that fear was gone. One afternoon, when classes ended and the students gathered for the ride home, Derek lingered by the bus steps. He watched as Maya climbed aboard, her posture calm and unshaken. Something inside him twisted. He wanted to lash out again, to prove he wasn't weak, but another part of him hesitated. He remembered the grip on his arm, the control in her eyes. More than that, he remembered the silence of the bus when everyone had turned against him. As he finally climbed aboard, he walked past Maya. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He expected to see pride or mockery in her face, but instead he saw calmness. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was simply moving forward, unbothered by his presence. The lack of hatred unsettled him more than any angry words could have. The bus ride home was quiet. Derek sat in the back again, staring out the window, lost in thought. He realized that Maya had taken something from him that he had never considered before, his image of control. And she hadn't taken it with fists or shouting, she had taken it with discipline, patience, and strength that he had underestimated. As the days passed, Derek slowly faded from the center of attention. His words no longer carried weight. When he tried to mock others, students ignored him or even rolled their eyes. The fear that once followed his voice had vanished. Meanwhile, Maya continued to grow in the respect of her classmates. She didn't become loud or boastful, she remained the same quiet, disciplined girl. But now, people looked at her differently. They saw her as someone strong, someone who could not be pushed down. On the bus, the atmosphere changed too. The silence that once allowed Derek's bullying to thrive was gone. Students began to talk more openly, laugh more freely, and even sit where they pleased without worry. Maya had unknowingly given them courage. By standing up for herself, she had shown them all that fear only held power if you allowed it. Weeks later, Derek finally approached Maya one morning. He walked down the aisle slowly, his steps uncertain. Students watched in curiosity, unsure of what he was about to do. He stopped beside her seat, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I was wrong, he muttered, his eyes downcast. I shouldn't have treated you like that. The bus went still. Everyone listened, waiting for Maya's reaction. She looked up at him, her face calm. She didn't smile, but she didn't scowl either. She simply nodded and said, "Then don't do it again." Her voice was steady, her words simple, but they carried more weight than a long speech ever could. Derek nodded awkwardly and moved away, sitting at the back once more. The students whispered again, but this time their whispers were filled with surprise. The bully who had once dominated the bus had admitted his fault. Maya hadn't needed revenge. She had only needed to hold her dignity and stand firm. And in the end, that was enough. From that day on, the bus rides were different. There was no more shouting, no more mocking. Derek kept to himself, quieter than before. Maya sat where she chose, her presence strong without her needing to prove it. The students around her felt safer, freer, and more willing to speak up when something wasn't right. Maya never thought of herself as a hero. She never wanted attention or praise. But through her patience, her calmness, and her strength, she had changed the atmosphere not just on the bus but in her school. She showed everyone that true power wasn't about making others small, it was about holding your ground with dignity. And as the months rolled on, her story became one that students remembered long after the year ended. They didn't remember Derek's mocking words. They remembered the quiet girl who stood tall, who refused to be pushed down, and who proved that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply sits calmly in the middle of the bus and refuses to move.